Good evening.
Evening. All right, so we are in the final episode of Sefer Shoftim, which begins on chapter 19, Perek Yutes, and this is known notoriously as the Pilegesh Givah, the concubine in Givah. Givah is the name of a city, and the Pilegesh means a quasi-wife. It's when somebody marries a concubine, it's without the formal kiddushin that is done, and without the kesuva contract. There are less obligations of the husbands towards the wife. And that's the scenario we're going to be discussing. It spans over the last three chapters of the book, 19, 20, and 21, the way our books are numbered. I think the wisest way to go about it here is we'll briefly go over the story, which appears basically on chapters 19 and 20. And then we'll go through it again with some insights and inquiries. Okay. So, okay, so what we will read inside the first time through is the opening line in chapter 19 is, Vayhi bayamim ahem. It was in those days, Umelech ein beYisrael, and there was no king in Israel. That is a very important introduction, and it was written by Shmuel, the author of the book of Shoftim, the prophet who put it into writing, obviously with prophecy, but he is the one who's writing it. And he writes this as an introduction to this story. And it's just as he introduced the previous story of the idol of Micha, which was a tragic situation amongst the Jews at that time, so too he introduces this story. And his point in these closing episodes of the book of Shoftim is to show the necessity for a king amongst the Jews, that these stories would not have been able to occur. The story we're about to learn now would not have happened. It wouldn't have been so tragic had there only been a king. If there was a king in Israel, this would not have happened. He would have been able to prevent this and put a stop to the awful events that we're going to see now. And in fact, the opinion of many of the commentaries is that chronologically, this story is out of place. This story actually happened in the beginning of the era of the judges, probably shortly after the death of Joshua, maybe even before Othniel ben Kenaz, maybe like before the successor of Joshua. And this happened that far back. But the reason Shmuel is putting it here at the end of the book is as a segue into the next book, is we're going to learn about the rise of the monarchy in Israel. So he's putting this here as a close to the book of Shoftim, an introduction into the era of kings. Okay, so the story goes something like this. There was a man in Har Ephraim. Okay, it's above mid-Israel, yeah, in the mountain of Ephraim. And he had a concubine, had a Pilegesh from Beis Lechem, Yehuda. And Yehuda is in the south of Israel, as we know. And it says, Vatizneh alav Pileksho, his concubine, she's zoneh alav. The word zenut sometimes can mean adultery. In this case, it probably does not mean adultery, because we see that she's not forbidden to him after this episode. Rather, what it means is she did something wrong to upset him, and then she left. And she goes back to her father's house. And she spends 4 months there, or possibly a year and 4 months. It depends how you read the text there. Did somebody speak up just now?
I have a question.
Sure.
The term married a concubine wife.
Yes.
We've seen discussions about marriage. We've seen discussion about wives. And we've seen discussions about concubines. But is this an early or first instance of married a concubine wife?
You hear this interesting expression, Isha Pilegesh, like a wife who was a concubine. Yeah, it's an interesting crossover. I'd have to, I was never sensitive to that. You'd have to check the other places where it appears. Like we saw it by, was it Abimelech? And his mother was the concubine. Good point. We'll have to do some research on that one. Okay, deep diving. So,
Avraham, his wife was a Pilegesh, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, what, like Hagar, the maidservant of Sarah?
No. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's the rabbinic version. That's the rabbinic commentary.
Oh, what were you referring to?
That says Keturah was a Pilegesh, doesn't it?
I think so. At least, I think so. So probably a very fruitful endeavor, is to contrast all the cases of Pilegesh in Tanakh.
What is Pilegesh? Is that slavery?
It's not a slave, it's a concubine, which means she's designated for this man, but he's not contractually obliged like he would be in a regular marriage. Therefore, if they just separate, it could be that she's not forbidden to other men. She doesn't necessarily need a divorce document. He also doesn't have the responsibilities that he would have towards his wife, like to sustain her, etc. So it's like a low-level wife. It's not a very honorable position to hold. The reason perhaps a woman would do this is just for companionship, or because of some other factor like that. But it's not an ideal relationship. The truth is, I believe the Rambam says that it's forbidden for a regular Jew to have a Pilegesh. It's not the type of relationship the Torah allows, with the exception of a king. The king is the only one who can have a Pilegesh, in which case this would be a violation, actually, and he wouldn't be doing the right thing here by having a Pilegesh. But there are others who argue and say, no, even a regular Jew can have a Pilegesh. So it's a quasi-wife. That's a good word for it. In English, we call it a concubine. There's no kiddushin, which is when the husband, so to speak, acquires her with an item of value. And there's no kesuva. He doesn't owe her anything, no money obligations and no obligations during the marriage either. Okay.
Well, obviously she's some kind of servant that can be ordered around by her mistress. I got the idea. She's the servant of Sarah, maybe not a slave, and that the custom in those days among the other tribes that were around was to have children, if you couldn't conceive from your husband, to take a maidservant and have her conceive, and then that child would be the heir.
That's true. I was not sure that Pilegesh necessarily implies servitude. It could be that oftentimes you'll take the maidservant as the Pilegesh, the concubine, but perhaps you're correct. Later on in the text, we'll see that her husband is referred to as her master. It's an interesting switch.
This is very confusing in all kinds of language that you're not quite sure what she is.
She's certainly, well, we know for sure she's not a regular wife. It's a lower status than regular wife. He has he has the right to be with her, and perhaps while they're together, she shouldn't be with others. But once they separate, there's no real issues. It's not recommended. Yes.
Looking through my which one is this? 1 second. I'm looking through my Evan Shoshan concordance for uses of the word Pilegesh in marriage, and the word that's used in the pasuk here, vayikach, is the same word that's used for marriage and for Pilegesh in many circumstances. But kachlo isha Pilegesh seems to be unusual.
The isha Pilegesh, that's what Mr.
As opposed to just Pilegesh.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we have some homework to do. This is interesting. The topic of Pilegesh in those times. It will come up a few other times in our journeys. Okay, so the story goes something like this. We'll briefly go over the story. She separates from him. She goes to her father's house. And after a little while, this husband gets up. He was a Levi, by the way, an Ish Levi. He was living in the area of Ephraim, but he was an Ish Levi. He was a Levi. And he goes to retrieve his wife. And there he refers to him as her husband, right? Her husband comes and he comes to appease her, and he goes to her father's house. And the father-in-law, it's interesting, he's being referred to as a father-in-law, right? So you do see there's like a quasi-marriage situation going on here. Her father-in-law insists, after 3 days of accepting this husband back, and they're very happy and they greet him and everything's great, he's about to leave on the 4th day. And he says, listen, why don't you stay a little bit, eat with us and drink? And he presses him and he presses him. And sure enough, the man stays and he eats and he drinks. And by the time you eat and drink, it's already late in the day, and you're also a little bit weary from the wine. Yeah, good 11 a.m. wine is never good for traveling, unless you're on a plane, I guess, and not the one flying. And he says, you know what, why don't you stay another day? So the Levi agrees. and he stays for a fourth night. And then on the fifth morning, the father-in-law says, why don't you come eat with us again? Stay. So the father-in-law is clearly very happy to have this man here, and he's being a very warm host, and he presses him to stay. So the Levi in this case eats, but he doesn't drink. He doesn't want to make the same mistake twice. And as the day begins to wane, they set off on their way. He says, I'm not sleeping another night, and it's time for me to go. So he leaves, but sure enough, because he left so late in the day, there's not enough time to make it home. So they find themselves, right? They're traveling from south, which is Bethlehem, where the wife was staying with her father. Now they're traveling back north to Mount Ephraim. So at that point, you would pass through Jerusalem area. So that's where they find themselves on the road around Jerusalem. It's Nochach Yevus Hi Yerushalayim. If you're looking inside, it's verse number 10. Kind of paraphrasing here. It's called Yevus because the Yebusites, the Yebusi, was living there at the time. They were actually in control of most of that area, most of the city of Jerusalem. This is another indication that this happened earlier in the times of the judges, because the non-Jews were primarily the inhabitants of that area. And as they're looking for a place to stay, the Levi says, let's not go to a city of non-Jews who says they're going to host us and they're not necessarily wholesome people. Let's go to our brethren, the Jews. We're anyways around the tribe of Binyamin. So let's go to the Givah. Givah was the name of the city of the Benjaminites. And let's go stay there. Okay, so he had faith. It was him, his wife, his servant, and 2 donkeys that they had with them. He had faith that let's just go to the Benjaminites and they'll host us. But sure enough, they come to the city and he sits there in the streets. And nobody takes them in. They're sitting there waiting for a host to pick them up. We just came through. It's late afternoon. The sun is setting and there's nothing doing. No one's coming. Until finally, an old man comes in verse 16, an ish zaken. Zaken could mean elderly. It could also mean wise. And he's coming home from work late, which could indicate that he was not of means. I mean, if he's working so late in the day, it must mean he needs the money. And nevertheless, he's actually not from that area, but he originates from Har Ephraim, and he says to them, come, why don't you come into my home? The Levi says to him, we have all the food we need. You don't have to feed us. Let us just sleep by you. And he insists, he says, we'll feed you. We'll take care of you. Come into my home. And so they go to this kind man's house, and he feeds their donkeys and everything. And then the strangest thing happens. And from here, everything begins to deteriorate. What seemed to be an okay story, right? It was strange that he didn't get picked up by any hosts until this old man came, who wasn't even a local. Suddenly, Heima Metivim, in verse number 22, the Anshe Ha'ir, Anshe B'nei Belial, people of the city, who have, a Belial means like without a yoke, lawless people, surrounded the house, and they start knocking on the door. And they tell the old man, bring the man out so we should lay with him, which is the strangest thing and eerily reminiscent of the people of Sodom, right, of Sodom. And they say, bring out your guest, bring out that man so we can lay with him. And the host says, my brothers, don't do this evil. This man has come to my house. Don't do this disgusting thing. Instead, take my daughter and take this man's Pilegesh. I'll bring them out to you, and you can have your way with them, and leave the man alone. And they didn't want to, but nevertheless, the Levi, the man, takes his Pilegesh, takes his concubine, and he thrusts her out the door, and it basically has an offering to these people, and evidently it appeases them, and they take his wife, his Pilegesh, his concubine, and they molested her all night long until the morning, and then as the sun rose, they sent her off. Right? So they do this despicable thing. They take his wife, and they're with her the whole night, and she is so battered from the way they treated her that by morning time she falls on the threshold of the door. The master, here refers to him as her master in verse number 27. Her master arises in the morning and he opens the doors to leave. Like it looks like he's planning on leaving him without his concubine. He's just ready to go. And sure enough, he finds this lady, his wife, laying on the ground. And he says to her, get up, we're going to go. She doesn't answer. He realizes she's dead. Okay, so this is a very terrible thing that just occurred. She was basically raped to death. And the man, what does he do? He takes his concubine's wife, her body, and he chops her up into 12 pieces. And he sends the 12 pieces of her body to the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes include Levi, as well as splitting Yosef into two, Manasseh and Ephraim. But he excludes Benjamin, because Benjamin are the tribe that perpetrated this evil. But he sends her body to all the tribes of Israel that were not involved in this. And along with that, most likely he sent the story of what happened. So he has this very graphic thing, right? They get a body part in the mail. He sent messengers with body parts and relaying the news of what happened. So that's awful, right? They didn't have such efficient media back then, but this did the trick. Sure enough, people get this terrible package, and they are roused to action. The entire Bnei Israel, all of the 12 tribes, except for Binyamin, they all are aroused to action, and they're furious, and 400,000 people come to the call, and they gather in a place called Mitzpah. Mitzpah, you may recall, is a city in Yeshua where all of the non-Jewish kings had gathered in the north to fight against the Jews, and there's a tremendous miraculous victory. So since there was a great miracle that occurred in Mitzvah, that ended up becoming a place where Jews came to gather. Aside from Shiloh, where the Mishkan, the tabernacle was, this was another place where Jews gathered. So 400,000 Jews all came together, and they said, what are we going to do with this? We have to do something about this. This is already entering into chapter 20. And they demand from Binyamin to give over the people who perpetrated this horrible act, right? Give us those men who killed the lady. And Binyamin refuses. Binyamin refuses to hand her over. And now what ensues is a civil war. 400,000 soldiers, plus 10% of the nation providing provisions, against Benjamin, which is about 27,000, 26,000 or so. Those are the numbers, right? The odds are stacked against Benjamin. But strangely enough, the Jews inquire with the Urim V'Tumim. They go to Pinchas, who was the Cohen, several hundred years old now. And they go to Pinchas and they say to him, who should go up first? And he says, Yehuda goes first. Isn't he the first to go all the time? That's what the Urim V'Tumim respond. And they send Yehuda. And the first battle, Binyamin does not suffer any defeat, but rather they kill thousands. They killed thousands of Bnei Israel. And the second battle, again, Binyamin suffers no losses, and they kill thousands of Bnei Israel. And the third time, the Jews repent, and they almost obliterate the tribe of Benjamin. They leave only 600 Benjamin people left. People from the tribe of Benjamin left. Only 600 people were left. Out of 20.
Weren't they all men? They were all men, right?
And they were all men, yeah. 600 men of Benjamin remained. Everything else was destroyed. The cities were razed, even their cattle. They treated them as if they were Ir Anidachat, a wayward city, which all turns to idolatry. Right? The mitzvah in the Torah, in Parshas Re'eh, I believe, is to destroy the city. They did that. They treated the city of Benjamin like that, and they completely destroyed Givah. They had some ambush, a particular strategy, and Benjamin was wiped out. And then the final the section of the book, tragic civil war, terrible, is they swear not to marry girls from Benjamin until that generation passes, and then after that, there's some wrapping up to do in chapter 21. Okay, so in short, we have this tragic incident that was a little bit long, but in short, we have a tragic incident where a man and a wife separate. He goes to get her. On the way back home, she's killed, molested by the tribe of Benjamin, by some of the lawless people there. He sends out her body parts. This incites a civil war between 400,000 of Bnei Israel, or really all the tribes of Israel versus Binyamin. And eventually they overtake Binyamin and almost completely destroy it, which is an awful, awful thing. And that's how basically the book of Shoftim ends. And the introduction to this was there was no king in Israel. So that's the haunting story of Pilegesh Givah. Let's now go through it with a little bit more detail, with finer strokes, to take out some themes and messages. But so far, so good. Are we all together?
Yes.
Okay, great. So in verse number 2, in chapter 19, it says, Vatizne alav Pilegesh, that his concubine deserted him, or she did something against him, and then she leaves. So the Talmud in Gittin actually has a discussion about what went wrong. And there are two opinions. One person says, Zvuv matzala, he found a fly in his food, and this upset him. The other opinion says he found a hair. He either found a hair in his food or a hair on her body, which was in a dangerous place for him, and that upset him, and he sent her away because of that. So the beginning of this terrible story begins with Shalom Bayis problems. The Gemara learns from this incident that a person should not be matil ema yaser besoch beso. He should not impose excessive fear in his home. In your home, it has to be a place of peace, not of anger and overbearing demands and insistence. And if there's a fly in the soup, then everything explodes. And if there's a misplaced hair, if you find hair in your pasta, you explode. That's not the way a home should be run. Home has to be a place of peace. And the Gemara says, because this Levi imposed excessive fear in his home, he was too overbearing and too frightening, it led to tens of thousands of Jews dying. It blames it on the lack of Shalom Bayis. So at the root cause of this issue, the Gemara pins it on a lack of Shalom Bayis, lack of marital peace. And from here we learn that things should be said in peace. Like, for example, the Talmud says, on Erev Shabbos, when there's a lot to do, you have to make sure the candles are set. You have to make sure the food is properly being heated for Shabbos. So you have to be giving instructions in your home, telling the family members what to do. But no matter what, you must say it pleasantly. Yes, things need to get done, and it's urgent. Shabbos is coming, and you can't do it after Shabbos comes in. But you say it with pleasantness. With pleasantness. It shouldn't be in an imposing and in a fearful way. And it takes it out from this story in Pilegesh Givah. Okay. So this is an oldie but a goodie. The man finds a fly in his soup and he says, waiter, what is this fly doing in my soup? And the waiter says, I believe he's doing the backstroke, sir. There you go. That's an oldie but a goodie. Moving forward. Yeah.
Okay, stay in this profession and
right.
stand up.
Advice taken. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that when the husband eventually comes around, it takes at least 4 months, maybe a year and 4 months. There's an interesting expression in the verse, Yamim arba'ah chodashim. In verse number 3, she was there for days, 4 months. So days sometimes means a year. So either there are 16 months or 4 months. But either way, the man comes back, and the father-in-law was very happy to bring him to take him back. And here we find a nice thing, right? Even though they had a falling out, the father-in-law and the wife were happy and pleased to restore the relationship and repair the relationship. And it seems like things are going well here. And here he's referred to as her husband. So he did a little bit of inner searching, it seems, and he overcame his anger, and they were able to resolve the conflict that they had. What's interesting is the story emphasizes that the father-in-law was extremely eager to keep this guy in his house. Stay another night. Come, just drink a little bit, just eat a little bit. So apparently, and that led to this issue because he insisted he stays and he eats. They ended up leaving a little bit too late in the day, and then they had to find lodging, and it led to this whole disaster. So it seems to be alluding to the fact, it's giving advice for a host now. You should be a very gracious host, and you should give your guests the impression that you're very excited to have them there. And that's the way that they should feel. On the other hand, don't be overbearing. and when it's time to go, you have to let them go. You don't keep schlepping it out. Another conversation, more insistence, right? You realize they have where to go. They're not just, he said, I have to go. He already stayed an extra day. And now you're going to make him have some more pancakes the next morning. You have to be sensitive. This is an interesting balance when it comes to chesed, loving kindness, that which we so admire and we so encourage. You also have to have a control on that. Infinite kindness will just drown the person, and you'll end up it'll be obnoxious and disturbing. Yeah, what did you say, Moshe?
What's the difference between the British and the Jews?
Go ahead.
The British leave without saying goodbye. The Jews say goodbye but never leave.
Very nice. Yeah, I like that. So here, interesting, it seems to be an allusion, advice to a host. So we started off with advice for the head of a household, and now we're giving advice for a host. Of as much as you want to be a gracious host, perhaps you should be more sensitive. You have to really see outside of yourself to notice the needs of the other person. And sometimes it's better not to give and let him go. Okay, so now we're discovering a little bit of, obviously the rest of the story, we see a lot of negativity about the Jewish people. But I do think that there are some bright spots here. First of all, this man is traveling with his servant, his attendant, his Pilegesh, his concubine, and a couple of donkeys. And they're on the road. So he says, let's not go to Yevus, the non-Jewish city. Let's go to our brethren, the Jews. It's a completely different tribe. They're absolute strangers. It's late in the afternoon. And without any advance notice, it's a matter of course to this person, of course they're going to host me. These are our brothers, the Jews. Of course they'll put me and my wife and my attendant and our donkeys up for the night. The assumption that they would have found a space to sleep is actually a beautiful testament about the quality of the nation that you're dealing with over there. It just so happens the place that they ended up in Givah, did not have these values, and that was a problem, right? They ended up staying in the streets until an old man came by and took them in. So the old man was a beautiful model of chesed, but the people of Benjamin were lacking over here, and that is a very big complaint on them. It's a very big criticism of them, I should say. Yeah. But on the other hand, you see again the assumption of the person that he will be hosted, he will find hosting. That's a really beautiful thing, right? How many people would be happy to host somebody who shows up on their door with a couple of donkeys and a wife and stuff, right? You at least need a night's notice, if not a couple of days, to prepare the linens.
I think that in the old days that happened more often than it happens now. People were at home and they could take in relatives without knowing that they were coming. I remember that from my childhood. But when everyone works and has something to do, it's a great deal more difficult.
Yeah. With all the advancements and conveniences we have today, we are less capable of doing the things we have to. Yeah. I just saw somebody complaining about air conditioning. It was an old documentary about air conditioning when it was first getting installed in homes, window units. And this person was complaining. He was upset. He said, I remember growing up, it was hot in the summer. So people would sit on their porch and the neighbors would spend time schmoozing with each other. We'd go to them and we'd sit on the front porch talking. They'd come to us. He said, now you walk through the streets, you don't hear the sounds of neighbors talking. All you hear the sound is the compressor in the window, and everyone's indoors enjoying their AC. And it made people more antisocial. The technological advancements actually making people more isolated and less gracious. Fascinating. Whoever complained about air conditioning, it's crazy. Did you say, Mr. Wilprint?
No, that's a good argument.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I never thought of that perspective. And then I went down the rabbit hole and I discovered that people also said that it made architecture a lot more boring, because each country had to adapt its architecture to the climate. Right? If you live in a hotter place, you'll have to make sure that you can ventilate it properly. You'll build the buildings in different shapes, etc. But now that we have ACs, it's all boring, rectangles in the sky. That was one of the reasons architecture changed, right? Aside from the availability of materials. Okay. Transitioning from air conditioning to now this very heated house situation. These people come and surround the house. So as we mentioned, this is a little bit too close to the episode with Sodom. It makes us very uncomfortable that the tribe of Benjamin should be like the people of Sodom that was destroyed, right, with ashes and salt and sulfur. Like, how could it be? So the Ramban on Chumash, he actually contrasts the two episodes. The episode with Lot and his daughters and the angels that came to be his guests, and this episode of Pilegesh Givah. And he says there are significant differences. It's not praiseworthy what happened here, but there are significant differences between the two stories. Number one is, over here, it was a band of lawless people. That's what the verse refers to them as, Bnei Belial. This was not the tribe of Benjamin. This was a bunch of lawless people, a bunch of thugs that came and surrounded the house. He says they weren't banging down the doors. It says they surrounded the house, as opposed to by Lot, they were banging, they're trying to knock the doors over, trying to break through. Here they knocked on the door and said, please bring out your guest. Right? There's a little bit more, even the lawless people among them were not as vicious. But also in Sodom, he says it was a legal thing. You're not allowed to bring in guests, and therefore the punishment is we have to come out, you bring them out so we can torture them. Here, there's no prohibition on welcoming guests into your home. Again, it was just a bunch of lawless thugs who were doing the wrong thing. That's one major distinction that he makes. He also says it wasn't the entire tribe of Benjamin. It was just these guys, this group of people which were unwholesome. And he has a third distinction, which is escaping me at the moment. But it's not, obviously it's not praiseworthy. It's still an awful thing that occurred here, but it's not as bad. It's not as built in as it was in Sodom. When I say built in, I mean in Sodom, it was like institutionalized wretchedness. Here, it was a one-off awful episode. Another insight into the quality of the people there is this person does this very dramatic thing and he mails out the body parts of the murdered Pilegesh. The response is, when Israel heard about that, they were all horrified and the entire nation united to come and fight against this. But nobody sat back and said, whatever, everybody wanted to take responsibility for this. And then we have to eradicate this from our midst. This can't be. That actually is a testament to the quality of the people here. Again, they know we can't have this. And the entire nation responds, 400,000 soldiers to come immediately upon hearing the news. When you say immediately, you can imagine it probably took a couple of weeks for everyone to gather. But you see that the nation was not happy with this. Now, what's going on with Benjamin? So in verse number 12, in chapter 20, they gather on Benjamin and they say to them, what is this outrage that occurred among you? And in verse 13, it says, they say, hand over the criminals and we will put them to death and we will eradicate the evil from our midst. But Binyamin did not desire to listen to their brethren. Why not? It's not that they were supporting the crime. What was happening here was an interesting political argument. Bnei Yisrael were saying, this is a national issue. And therefore, we as a nation are acting as like the Sanhedrin when the entire nation comes together. There is no king, but the king has the right to put people to death, even though they didn't violate a capital crime. We want to put this person, this is a national issue, and therefore we're using our national force by coming all together. It's as if we're the king, and we want to put them to death. And Benjamin said, no, this is a local issue. We agree that what they did was wrong, but it's not don't come mixing into our business. This is our tribal issue, and we'll take them to task. We'll do what we feel is necessary. You can't start, mixing into our business and telling us what to do and how to treat our criminals. Put them to death? Maybe not. We're not going to put them to death. So they refused to hear the voice of their brothers. They didn't feel like this was a national issue and didn't want to join this coalition. And that is exactly why the whole introduction to the story is, in those days, there's no king in Israel. If there was a king in Israel, this wouldn't have happened. The king comes in and he says, finished, off with his head, done. And nobody could argue with that. Here they were arguing, is this a national issue? Is this a Benjamin issue? Who's going to take responsibility? And how will it be? Right? So you can imagine the political discourses that they were having at that time. It was a technical issue, and they were running in circles. Nobody can solve it. The 12 tribes said it's a big problem. This one said, no, it's my problem.
Isn't there a religious law that you can't turn somebody over to certain death?
Very good. If an aggressor comes and says, hand one person over,
Yeah.
I'll kill you all, you're not allowed to hand him over. Yeah, that is correct.
Okay.
The only reason in this case, or perhaps I wonder if Binyamin invoked that. The only reason in this case that they would say hand him over is because they're saying he deserves death. And it's not that we're an aggressor, right? This is like the Sanhedrin is coming together and saying that we issued a ruling to death. Like now we have a summons to come to court. You're not sending him. So you're trying to fracture the Jewish people. You're trying to break away and destroy the unity of the Jewish people. The Mefarshim say, I think it's the Abarbanel explains that they thought that this was a national security risk. If you're breaking away from the other 12 tribes, how are we going to make decisions in times of war when there's an outside aggressor? When enemies come from the outside and Binyamin is not on board, that's going to be a disaster. We won't be able to make decisions. We won't be able to mobilize forces. This is a huge issue. Enough that we should start a civil war rather than let this continue. So again, it's all a precursor to to show that we needed a king in Israel.
Again, but this wasn't one person. This was a group of people. That,
Correct.
yeah, right. It's
Correct. It's even though it's
gang.
still
Yeah, it's a gang. Yeah.
Yeah. A gang. Yeah, well said.
Gang of evildoers.
We do have to wrap it up. But what's interesting is that the first 2 times Bnei Israel attack Benjamin, they lose. Why did they lose? And then eventually the 3rd time they end up overtaking Benjamin. So there are multiple reasons given in the commentaries, Rashi and the Gemara, as to why they failed. One is God said to them, you're so eager to stand up for the honor of this concubine. What about my honor? There is a Pesel Micha, the idol of Micha is still in existence. There's a whole temple with an idol that's mixing smoke together with the smoke from the tabernacle, and you're not concerned about my honor. You're so concerned about the honor of humans and not my honor. And they fell in war because of this lacking of Pesel Micha. Right? This issue that we read about last time, we learned about that idol and that house of idolatry. God was saying, you're not being consistent. You care about one thing more than the other. Like the guy who says, oh, I can't wake up for davening. It's too early. 6:30 in the morning, it's too early. And then suddenly there's like some sporting event. He'll wake up at 5:30 in the morning, make sure he has his jersey ready, right? He'll travel halfway across the country. You're not being consistent. If you're a tired guy, I understand. Okay, maybe I can forgive, if it's hard to wake up early in the morning. But for sports to wake up and not for God, this wasn't sports, but you're not being consistent. As opposed to the one person, the first day of vacation started in yeshiva, and this boy walks into the base medrash, and the Rosh Yeshiva says to him, what happened? You were supposed to go back home. He said, I overslept. I missed my flight. And the Rosh Yeshiva was so happy. He says, until now, I thought, you just had a hard time waking up for davening because you didn't care so much. But now I see you even have a hard time waking up for your flight. Baruch Hashem, you're being consistent. There's no distortion of values here. It's just have a hard time waking up. And so here, the complaint of the Jewish people, you're being inconsistent. You're caring about your issues, and you're not caring about God's issues, which is interesting. I would think this is like a godly issue, right? This terrible crime that was perpetrated. But he was saying, you should also care about Pesel Micha. Additionally, the Jews are faulted here for they never actually asked whether they should go to war. The question, when they approached Pinchas, the Kohen Gadol, and they asked through the Ur Metumim, their question was, who should go first? As if to say, we know that we need to go to war, and we already worked out the strategy and everything, but who should go first? You just tell us. The response was, you want to know who goes first? Yehud goes first because that's who goes first, but I never said you should go to war. And they fell. And the second time, they ask, should we go to war? And the answer is yes. But they didn't ask, are we going to win? Meaning to say, that they're faulted for, they should have checked, are we spiritually strong enough to be victorious? They didn't ask, and they fell again. And by the third time, they had repented. And here it's that God showed, and then they asked, should we go to war? Are we going to be victorious? And Hashem said, yes, you should go and fight against Binyamin and eradicate this from your midst. Hashem wanted to make it absolutely clear that it's not their strategizing, not their 400,000 people that's going to win. It's not their passion, etc. It's only because God says so. That's the way the Jews need to operate. And even if you have the best intentions, you have to make sure that it's clear and pure when you're dealing with things of this gravity. Okay, there are some final points, but davening is upstairs in a moment or two. So therefore, I bid you a good evening, and God willing, next time we meet, so I suppose it'll be in 2 weeks. God willing, next time we meet, we will be concluding the book of Shoftim.
Okay, I just have a quick question. Yeah, the Mika, where they had idols, was it one idol? I was thinking that it was the teraphim, which are like the idols of Abraham's father, right?
Oh, that's a good point.
Right.
Referred to as Pesel Micha, I think those were accessories more than, there was like one thing which was the main show. The Pesel of Micha, the idol of Micha that his mother had.
Okay, but you don't know what that idol was. If it's one idol, what, instead of a collection of household items.
Those items were just accessories to that idol. What was the shape of the idol? I don't recall. They were at the beginning of chapter 17 there, right?
Okay, well, we can do it next week. I don't want to take your time if you're in a hurry.
All right,
I'll try to remember it next week. And ask.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, in 2 weeks, sorry.
All right. Have a good night and a good Shabbos.
Night.